Hi, and welcome to our first screencast for Canton City Schools. This is Dr. Jennifer Martin, and Professor Martina Sharp-Greer will be delivering our next screencast. So this one is on culturally relevant curriculum, and it is extending our simulation that we had earlier in the week. Elliot Eisner, an educational theorist, argues that there are three curricula that all schools teach: the explicit or obviously stated curriculum, the implicit, not official or hidden curriculum, and the null curriculum, meaning what we don't talk about at all. The explicit curriculum involves the publicly stated goals of education. So what is explicitly in your lesson plans, in your textbook, in the state standards, in the goals of the school or classroom. The implicit curriculum is the learning and interaction not explicitly announced. So Elliot Eisner calls the hidden curriculum the implicit curriculum because it is what students learn about the values of the school and the expectations of adults, both of which may be unintended, that are not included in the formal curriculum, but that students learn during their school experience. Hidden or implicit curriculums can serve to reinforce existing social inequalities. Longstreet and Shane in 1993 defined the hidden curriculum as, quote, the kinds of learnings children derive from the very nature and organizational design of the public school, as well as from the behaviors and attitudes of teachers and administrators, unquote. The hidden curriculum of a classroom or school informs students implicitly or explicitly what the teacher or the school values or does not value. And like we discussed last week during our simulation, it doesn't always have to be negative, but often it is. Elliot Eisner calls the hidden curriculum the implicit curriculum because it is what students learn about the values of the school. And again, hidden or implicit curriculums can serve to reinforce existing social inequalities. So as we talked about last year, sometimes schools reinforce school language or standardized Englishes and don't realize or understand that the vernaculars and Englishes that students speak or home languages are equally valid. So it's intentionally having these conversations that, hey, the ways in which you're speaking aren't necessarily wrong, but they're not the school language with which you'll be graded and judged by the workforce. So having those explicit conversations with students about the power code and the ways in which they need to be taught standardized English, all of these things matter. But if we're doing it in a positive way while embracing other types of Englishes, we're doing a good job. So this is a little breakdown of the implicit or the hidden curriculum and some of the components that it may involve. So the text in which you choose for your class. We need to be intentional when we think about whose perspective and points of view are represented in the text that we are choosing for students to read. So just to give you a quick example, when I was teaching English years ago at the alternative school, my student population consisted mostly of male students. And I tried to be very intentional about choosing various types of diverse texts, novels, points of view, from people of color, from women. And my students were very negative about reading texts that were written by and about women. And so they would be very, very negative and say things like, this has nothing to do with me, this is stupid, I don't want to read this. And I consulted with another English teacher who had held that position before I did. And I asked her, how do you deal with this resistance to reading texts about and by women? And she said, I just don't read those. I don't have my students read those. I don't fight that fight. So in that classroom, the few girls that were in there may have gotten the message that texts and stories about women and by women weren't valued or important. So I was willing to fight that fight because I wanted all of my students and my male students to understand that all perspectives and points of view have value. Moving forward as a teacher educator at Mount Union, I asked my students what the hidden curriculum of their high school classrooms were and what texts they read, and if they read novels from written by people of color and women. And when they thought back, not only did they realize that they had read very few, but also they never even thought about it. So they never even thought, I wonder why we're not reading texts that are not in the traditional canon, texts written by people of color and women. So that's pretty troubling that they didn't even think that was a problem. So other components falling underneath the umbrella of the hidden curriculum could be classroom practices, the norms of the classroom, who is called on where people sit, and the values that are communicated by the practices that the teachers engage in. So it could include discipline policies, things like that. Teacher talk, what the teacher says and does not say, can tell the students a lot about what teachers value, including who is called on and who's not called on. Posters and other wall art, very, very important. Sometimes when I talk about culturally relevant curriculum, math teachers will say, well, I don't really, this doesn't really impact me because math is just math, and what you can hang on the walls in a math class can really communicate that you're valuing various cultures and perspectives. So think about what other aspects of classrooms and schools can impact the hidden curriculum. And finally, according to Eisner, the null curriculum deals with what is systematically excluded, neglected, or not considered. So things that you don't even think about. And I want to give you an example of this. So I teach multicultural education for undergraduate students, and so I have a variety of different disciplines in my classroom. So intervention specialist students, future English teachers, future math teachers, future social studies teachers, etc. And I asked them in their educational histories when they had learned about people of color, for example. So I asked them, have you ever learned about the Jewish religion or Jewish points of view other than learning about the Holocaust? And they all thought, and they said, you know what, no. And then I asked, okay, so when in high school, when you learned about the African American experience in history, did you only talk about slavery? So, and they were like, wow, yeah, pretty much. But I never thought about that before. So we need to be really intentional when incorporating different points of view, particularly the points of view, cultures, and perspectives that are reflected in our own classrooms, that we're not doing so by only talking about negative things, atrocities, genocide, slavery, things like that. So just something to think about that maybe we don't think about enough. So I'd like you to think about, and this is a metaphor, the concept of curriculum as a window versus curriculum as a mirror. So it's important for students to have curriculum as a window, meaning that they're looking out into the world and looking at and analyzing various different perspectives that they don't share, learning about different cultures, learning about different values. But it's also important for students to be introduced to curriculum as a mirror, where their points of view are reflected in the content. So think about, is your curriculum a mirror to your students, a window, or is it a mix of both? I feel as though we need to work very intentionally toward our curriculum being a healthy balance of a window and a mirror. So think about that metaphor and what it has to do with Eisner's theories. So James Banks, you may or may not have heard of him in your teacher education programs. He's considered to be the father of multicultural education. And the simulation that we did last week stemmed from his conceptions of the evolution of curriculum in America. So the first map that we looked at, which was very few pieces, all white, and pretty much symbolized the mythical norm or the traditional canon that we have used since the institution of public education in our country. So it's the curriculum of the mainstream. It is Eurocentric and male-centric. And it ignores the experiences, voices, and contributions of non-dominant individuals and women. Banks argues that this stage is harmful for both students who identify with the dominant culture and those from non-dominant groups. It has negative consequences for the former because it, according to Banks, quote, reinforces their false sense of superiority, gives them a misleading conception of their relationship with other racial and ethnic groups, and denies them the opportunity to benefit from the knowledge, perspectives, and frames of reference that can be gained from studying and experiencing other cultures and groups. So essentially, we all benefit from learning about diversity. The curriculum of the mainstream has negative consequences for students from non-dominant groups as well, failing to validate their identities, experiences, and perspectives. According to Banks, it further alienates students who already struggle to survive in a school culture that differs so greatly from their home culture. So think about the directions that you were given in that simulation. The people who were not given pieces of the puzzle were silent and not engaged with the curriculum. And although it was a metaphor, it kind of gives you something to harken back to when you're thinking about building your curriculum. Who is represented and how does representation make students feel? The next stage in evolution, and this is pretty much where most schools, including Mount Union, where we are in our development. And this stage is Heroes and Holidays. It's also known as the ethnic additive approach. And this is kind of like where we have our traditional curriculum of the mainstream and we kind of just add on pieces. We're not fully integrating various genders and cultures and religions. We're just kind of adding pieces on. So teachers at this stage celebrate difference by integrating information or resources about famous people and the cultural artifacts of various groups into the mainstream curriculum. Bulletin boards might contain pictures of Martin Luther King Jr. or Rosa Parks, and teachers might plan special celebrations for Black History Month or Women's History Month. Student learning about other cultures focuses on costumes, foods, music, and other tangible cultural items. Now, is this a bad thing? No. Is it the best we can do? No. The strength of this stage are that the teacher is attempting to diversify the curriculum by providing materials and knowledge outside the dominant culture. And the Heroes and Holidays approach is fairly easy to implement, but it does have some weaknesses. By focusing on celebratory attention on non-dominant groups, the teacher, and this is unintentional, right? Focusing these groups as the other because they're not fully integrated. Curricula at this stage can tend to fail to address the real experience of non-dominant groups, focusing on just the accomplishments of a few heroic characters. The special celebrations at this stage often are used to justify the lack of effort at more authentic transformative